I'm Christine Passo, and I'm the host of Unconscious Evolution. Today, I warmly welcome my very good friend and fellow coach, Nicholas Whitaker. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Christine. It's always good to see you.
Oh, God, the feeling is mutual. So, listeners, let's learn a little bit about Nick. Nicholas Whitaker is the co founder of Changing Work. He's also a coach for high performers, conscious leadership advocate, husband, and cat dad. His current ambition is to empower high performers and leaders to reconnect with themselves and the world around them. That just makes me feel all warm inside. Nick's contact Nick's contact information and social media details are listed in the show notes, so please feel comfortable reaching out to him. He's about the friendliest guy you'll ever know. So, Nick, thank you again for opening your personal life to us all today. What would you like to share? And has anything come up for you in the hours leading up to our recording?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you again for just giving me the opportunity to connect and talk. Um, it's interesting because, I came in right before we started recording this. I was telling you, I came in really raw and just fresh, with no preconceived notions of what I wanted to share. But I've been in a lot of different community groups and a lot of different kind of workshops where like you basically pass the talking stick around, and once the stick arrives to you, you hang on to it. You kind of just check in with yourself, and you're like, all right, what's up for me right now? So that's essentially where I'm at, is like kind of checking in with myself and like what's up and alive for me right now. And I'd say like over the last, well, since we're recording this on November 19th of 2024, so it's only been a handful of days since the announcement of our new president-elect and the entire ramp up to that. And I've been in this really interesting period of time of introspection and reflection about what it all means, and what is the role of the work that I'm doing in the world in relationship to that. So in a very specific way, what's been coming up for me is like, what is the role of positive masculinity in the world, and what is the gap between the way I was raised, which I was raised blue collar family, influenced by a Southern United States father, Southern Baptist, who grew up without a father. And it was a very rough childhood growing up in that environment. There was abuse in the household. There was abuse from my father to my mother and my sister, physical and emotional abuse. Similarly, I experienced that myself in various degrees. And over the last few days, I actually have been reaching back out to and reconnecting with some of my relatives who I have basically been estranged with for the better part of 2 or 3 decades, including my half sister. And one of the things that's been really top of mind for me is like, what has the role of masculinity played in my life in terms of the trajectory that I took, the struggles and complications that I ran into, and now, as an adult, witnessing the world unfolding the way that it is, and noticing that just by the data and the statistics, there's this mass influx of young white men who have been migrating to or been attracted to authoritarian, strong men as a representation of like what masculinity means to them. Now, it puts it in a really interesting context for me because, myself, the way I identify, I am a man, I'm a male. I identify as masculine, but I was always, when I was growing up, finding myself at odds with the way masculinity showed up from other people. I didn't have a lot of good role models that really demonstrated what positive, healthy, generative masculinity really looked like. And having come from that world, having come from the blue collar experience, and having come up from poverty, I get it. Like, I understand why so many young men have been attracted to these strong men and have been attracted to this particular style of masculinity based on fear, based on aggression, based on othering. And it's really created all these interesting questions in my mind of like, okay, well, how do I show up as a man in contrast to that? How do I help show other people a different way of being that is more wholesome, perhaps, and is more conscious and is more compassionate and takes the whole person into account? But then also in a very concrete way, I'm trying to think through, like, geez, do I start a men's group? Do I like join a men's group? Do I, start reaching out to younger people? And It's a very long-winded story of saying, like I've been dabbling and experimenting with this a little bit over the last few weeks, and I put a couple posts out on Threads and Instagram and LinkedIn and my newsletter, and was kind of shocked at the feedback that I got and some of the pushback that I got from different people.
Would
So,
you be willing to share some of that? Because I
oh,
think,
sure.
I love the direction that this is going in. And, listeners, I never have any idea what my guests are going to talk about. And sometimes they don't either. And I don't think, Nick, you had a thought that this is the direction you were going to go. And I think this is a really important conversation just as a whole, like
Yeah.
not siding politically one way or the other, but
Yeah.
just opening this dialogue for a lot of the feelings that are happening on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. Well, even just this morning, I tried. Well, today is International Men's Day. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I
Uh,
am not, but thank you
yeah,
for telling me.
yeah,
Okay,
and
November 19th.
November 19th, and like what it basically is a day to help bring men's issues more to the forefront. So things like mental health issues, things like the role of men in leadership and mentorship, highlighting some of the positive aspects that men contribute to the world. And I woke up this morning, knew that this day was coming, and was really conflicted about what I wanted to share and what I wanted to post, because even the idea of masculinity right now and the way that it's currently being defined is highly problematic. And so I go to ChatGPT, I start posting, a couple thoughts into there to try to get it to help me write a post, which I often do. And, typed in a few words about like the role of masculinity in our current political, geopolitical and economic system that we're in, and how the shifts and changes in our awareness around masculinity probably contributed considerably to the political landscape that we're currently in the United States. And ChatGPT was like, no, I can't do that for you. And I was
So
like,
they're off the record, out of bounds for political stuff.
exactly. Yeah. And they
Yeah.
were basically saying that a conversation around the role of masculinity in relationship to politics is too sensitive a topic, and it goes against their terms of service. And so here I am kind of thinking about this. Like, you think about ChatGPT and like the company that owns that and the brains that are behind that and the type of approach and mindset that's driving the creation of these types of tools, to me, is representative of part of the problem that we're experiencing right now. It's this extractive, transactional, domineering, growth at all costs type of approach to business and leadership. But then I would also connect the dots between that and masculinity. So, I wrestled with it a little bit. If you can actually go on LinkedIn right now, you can actually see the post that I ended up with, which is basically a show and tell of like what I was actually getting in terms of responses from prompts. But to me, it's indicative of the problem where our tools, our technology, our culture has created a scenario where we cannot have these conversations without it being political and without it being a process of othering. And as a man in America, I think what it does is it shuts people down, and it makes, I would imagine, a lot of men feel obsolete and without purpose and without guidance. And even myself, trying to figure out what my role is as, a modern elder or as an adult, like trying to navigate all of these things, it really throws into question, like what is it exactly that we're doing here? And what's the path through? How do we start these conversations and start these dialogues in a way that invites men into their full expression of their emotions, not just their anger and their rage and their disappointment, but their sympathy and their empathy and their compassion and their fear and everything else.
Yeah. So you bring up something that's really interesting. And of course, I can only speak from a female. I identify as a female. So from the female's perspective, in my own view, right?
Mm.
This is just what I see, what I feel. But when the election results came out, and even a little bit before, I started recognizing and being very aware of how people were responding.
Mhm.
And a lot of people were responding in a way of, I just need to take care of myself
Mhm.
and my circle, my tight knit circle. I have to be able to find peace. And immediately, and I have goosebumps preparing to say this, but I'm like, oh my God, we're about to isolate even more,
Mhm.
because maybe half of the country feels safe and secure. Maybe they do, maybe they don't.
Mhm.
Maybe across the board there are hesitations. We're never 100% sure of hardly anything we do in life. I mean, unless it's personal, right?
Sure.
Unless it's about ourselves. But I thought, oh my gosh, like what are the ramifications going to be as an overall culture? And I've also communicated with other cultures, other connections in other countries that
Mhm.
have expressed their concerns just for the divide, right? Like we have so much going on. And I thought, what? COVID already created an isolation. People are trying to come out still unsure about who they are.
Mhm.
And you bring up such a beautiful observation about masculinity, leadership, who are we following, different messages. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we going to look like in
Hmm.
2 years?
Yeah.
Are we all staying back at home and locking our door? I mean, this really is potentially a cultural, a countrywide dilemma that is very related to everything that you were just talking about.
Oh yeah, and I would even expand it even beyond our country. I don't think that this is isolated specifically to the United States. I mean, you look at Brazil, Hungary, Korea,
Yeah.
like all these different China, Russia, you see all these different strong people, strong men, being heralded as this next great leaders. And there's definitely a shift globally to right wing extremism. And isolationism and xenophobia and bigotry and racism. I mean, it's happening. It's real.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, you mentioned something I think that is really interesting. You said that maybe there's like half of the United States is actually feeling pretty secure. I would actually say that that's probably not the case.
Yeah. And I
People
agree
who
with
are
you.
people who are secure, people who are secure in their masculinity, for example, secure in their status as an individual within society, do not vote as single issue voters. And I think that's so much of what I'm seeing right now. Is to your point, people are retracting into themselves, just dealing with themselves and their immediate circle, and not seeing what the ramifications are for that when you kind of expand that out to a national scale, specifically when it comes to things like voting. So many of the people that were voting towards the right, and even the left for that matter, were voting on single issues, right?
Mhm.
I read a report not too long ago that was talking about the downfall of Kamala's entire campaign, where they were basically talking about, and rightly so, the need for more support when it comes to women's rights, women's healthcare, minorities, like all of these folks that definitely need their support. But nowhere in that messaging was like, oh, and by the way, you, white male, 20-something-year-old in Appalachia country, which is where I came from, here's what we're doing to help you as well.
Right.
So there was already kind of an othering being set up within that particular campaign. Same thing on the right, and it was so much about not just excluding certain people, but othering people, saying,
Right.
well, trans folks are the problem, or women are the problem, um, minority hires, are the problem, this, that, and the other. Immigrants are the problem coming into the country. It's all of these things other than us taking a darn good look at ourselves and figuring out like, well, how am I contributing to this? How am I
Right.
contributing to the problem by just focusing on my own specific needs? And I think for me, that's where I get very concerned, not just for our country, but globally, where we're turning so far towards our own specific needs that we're letting go of and almost vilifying folks who look at others and ask the question, how do we all support each other?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so listeners, this is probably the most political I will get because I really don't like talking about politics. I never have, but I also don't mind speaking what I feel and my thoughts. And to me, what I've seen, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Nick, is based on your upbringing that you shared with all of us in the beginning, that I feel like a lot of people, including myself, am almost giving in isn't the right word, but laying down
Mhm.
essentially. The decision is made. We now have 4 years ahead of us. And it's like, how can I just be quiet until it goes away?
Mhm.
Which is a bully scenario.
Mhm.
It is a physical and verbal abuse scenario where I do not want this to escalate anymore. I do not have any control over that other person. So, what can I do to save myself?
Mhm.
And I see a lot of this happening.
Yeah.
And And in that, there is that self protection mode. There is that self, preservation mode. And again, the isolation. But it sends the wrong message too, because it's very disempowering. And then so for folks like myself or other people, it's what is it that we're going to do?
Mhm.
How are we going to come together to continue to empower each other in an environment that we're only given so much space?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think it's a very normal response. I was talking with my wife about this the other day. We were talking about madness and insanity and, how crazy making the last couple years have been. And specifically,
Eight
this,
plus, yeah.
yeah, specifically like the last few years through COVID. And, as we're kind of like coming quasi out of that into this like very disruptive political environment. Well, first of all, I think everything that you just shared to me is not political, it's social.
Yeah.
And, it's become political. It's being positioned as political to create a differentiation where it's like, well, these are my issues, these are your issues. And there's this bifurcation happening where I see this is integral to the fabric of our culture and our society. Like just to take a look at America, just specifically, if we abandon large parts of our community, if we isolate or ostracize people, or if we create a dynamic where I am not willing to have a conversation with somebody because they believe something different than me, we are doomed as a society. And I don't know that a lot of people are really kind of talking about it in those terms. They're talking about it in terms of these single issues, right? Oh, it's like, oh, I want abortion rights. I want gun rights. I want better healthcare. I want cheaper groceries, whatever it might be. But the real underlying issue here is that we have abandoned large members of our communities
Yes.
on both sides. And we've abandoned ourselves in some ways.
Yep.
And the appropriate response is madness. The appropriate response is being unstable. The
Yep.
appropriate response is to use your words, like laying down and saying, I just want to keep quiet. It's a
Yep.
defense mechanism.
Yep.
And to me, if you kind of treat our culture and our society in the same way that you might treat an individual that's suffering from post-traumatic stress, I think that could be a very good model to kind of look at. Well, how does one approach care? How does one approach a means to help someone move through and past that?
Yeah.
Dialogue is an important component of it. Self-reflection is a big component of that. Giving people safe spaces to have conversations is a big component of that as well. And, I think we all have an obligation, and in our own ways, we're going to be able to do this to differing degrees. But I think we all have an obligation to lean in and to stand up and speak and to create dialogue, just as we're doing right here, to help other people see and hear that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And potentially maybe create enough dialogue and conversations we can find solutions together that help
Yeah.
all of us rise.
Absolutely. And a lot of my coaching focus has pivoted a bit to healing,
Mhm.
right? Because we just are not fully cognizant of how hurt we are. And I'm not just talking about our current situation with the election or the last 8 years. We're not paying attention to that pain and that need to heal. And this of all times is such a pivotal time to heal. To
Mhm.
heal so that we can let go of the need or the desire to not have a conversation with somebody else because they are different.
Mhm.
Heal from that pain. Like why have you singled out that pain instead of allowing it to be open? And we've really gotten ourselves into quite a corner with this, I think, and feeling like there are very few people that we can talk to, which is then why we push away those that are different and only collectively bring in the ones that are the same. And in that, we're just it's not good for us either, because then
Mhm.
we're really limited. What I'm going to steer us a little bit here, Nick. What have you done in your life over the years, recent, that you have noticed to preserve that masculine man of yourself? That you are a coach. You're a very, deep minded coach. You're very spiritual. What is it that you've done for yourself? Because the thing is, this continues to evolve. So what you did 3 years ago, it's not going to work anymore.
Mhm.
Everything's different now. So, how are you creating this expanded life of acceptance and
Mhm.
growth and peace?
Yeah, well, it's a very powerful question, and essentially it's a prescription, I think for a lot of people. Um, Look, we all need to do our own work, first and foremost. And I think part of the problem here is a lot of us, and I would count myself among us, have not allowed ourselves to express the pain or the suffering or the fear that we're experiencing. So we kind of tend to gloss over things and it's business as usual. It's just, I need to focus on getting the paycheck. I need to focus on whatever it is. And we don't really slow down enough to actually take the time to ask the hard questions of ourselves. Like, am I showing up in the ways that I want to, that are aligned with my values, that are aligned with my core beliefs, that are aligned with the type of person that I want to be in the world? Um, Once you start asking yourself those questions, then it opens up this huge opportunity for personal development and growth. And I'm still on a growth trajectory. I will likely always be on that growth trajectory. And even recently, I've had some ups and downs in my life. I have throughout my entire life had ups and downs and had different levels of awareness of like how well I was connecting with myself throughout that period in time. And even just most recently, I just reached out to an ex-girlfriend from almost 20 years ago. Actually, it was longer than that. It was back in 1998. We moved into an apartment together in Baltimore when I was barely an adult. I think I was like 19 or 18 years old. Wasn't even old enough to drink. And it was a complete disaster. Like we were just horrible to each other. And all this time, I had this story that I was telling myself that the harm that I had done to this person just by not having the faculties and the skills to manage my own trauma at the time, to reach out to this person and to express regret and to apologize would cause more harm. So it took me until I was 46 to actually reach out and offer as just a simple text message like, hey, I've been thinking a lot about our time together. I've been thinking a lot about how I showed up back then, and I've done a lot of personal development in my life, and I recognize now how traumatized I was, and I'm sorry. So that's one very small version of what I'm doing. I think in bigger ways, tomorrow I'm going to be going to a men's group that's led by a Zen monk who is here in Boulder, Colorado. He's bringing a men's group together, conscious men talking about emotions, talking about what it means to be a man in America. Um, I'm talking with other coaches about, possibly creating a men's group of my own. And then I'm also talking with other coaches about like, well, is a men's group exclusionary? Should we actually be creating mixed groups to have these conversations and talk about masculinity and femininity and all those things? And just to back up for a second, like I don't believe in the binary of masculinity and femininity. I think that in its own right has actually caused othering, and there's a whole other topic we probably don't have time to get into. But what I'm doing is a combination of that deep introspection, that personal development, spending time meditating, spending time journaling, spending time talking with people that I've contacted throughout my life, mostly women who I probably wasn't the best version of myself when we were together, and having conversations about like, well, how did I show up back then? And how did that impact you? And if you could wave a magic wand and make things different, like what would you prefer? What would you have preferred to have happened between us back then? And then I'm bringing that forward into my current relationship. I've been married with my partner for going on about 13 years now. And we're navigating all of this together and asking these tough questions of like, well, what does it mean to be, a child-free couple in the United States today? Like, what does all these things mean, and how do we contribute in a way that's meaningful and that hopefully moves us more towards unity and more towards peace and more towards a compassionate approach?
Yeah.
So it's a combination of things, but just to summarize, I think it starts with doing your own work. It starts with identifying and acknowledging that there's work to be done, and then it's being courageous enough to ask for help and to build community around yourself in a way that helps you rise.
Yes. Oh my, you bring up such a like bomb dropping point, is that until you can ask yourself the hard questions, and then here's the kicker, answer them honestly.
Yeah.
not to answer them. So when you're asking yourself these questions like, who am I? How can I contribute more to the male community or whatever it might be? It's our instinct to get defensive. It's like, well, I'm already doing that. I
Mhm.
post on LinkedIn and I have a lot of male friends and I've always told them I'm here for them and I've coached men.
Yeah.
We get defensive because we automatically feel like we're being questioned. Well, you're the one questioning yourself.
Mhm.
And it's okay to say, I'm not showing up the way that I want to, because that's when change happens.
Mhm.
The defensiveness is what's keeping us where we are and where we have been for 8+ years,
Yeah.
right? It's not answering, why am I shutting all these people out in my life? What is it about me? What is it about my values? What is it about what I want? And how can I still connect?
Mhm.
And taking ownership of that. And I think that is something that we could really do, as a whole, all of us, because that is where the empowerment comes. It's not scary and it's not finger pointing. I
Yeah.
think a lot of us are afraid to do it. A lot of people are afraid to look in the mirror because they're
Mhm.
like, "Oh my gosh, I know there are so many things that I regret. I've behaved badly and I have this many people to apologize to." It's okay. It's like,
Mhm.
how do you want the rest of your day and your future to go on? Because by answering that question honestly, that's where everything changes. Otherwise, we're stuck. We're right here. We're not going anywhere. And this conversation that we're having, we will have the same conversation in 4 years.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I think, just in a handful of men that I've talked to that are responding in a negative way to this type of a challenge, mostly it's online. So I posted on Threads a couple days ago, and immediately, as soon as I started talking about masculinity, had a handful of people reaching out to me and basically aggressively trying to downplay the conversation. Say it's like, well, it's not just toxic men; it's also toxic women. It's like, yeah, that's not the point. The point is
Right.
that we have a role to play in this as men, and there is an open question around what the role of men is in American society, and it's a valid question. It's a valid question to explore. And what I saw a little late in the game, like my first few replies to these individuals were not me showing up in my best version of myself. I was actually showing up quite defensively and actually quite aggressively. And immediately I was able to check myself and realize, like, oh wow, like I'm actually even getting caught up in this toxicity, and it's contagious, right? So it takes a lot of forethought. It takes a lot of, I think, courage to be able to stand in facts, to stand in your own experience and speak from your own experience and not paint things with a broad brush. And to have conversations with people who maybe don't agree with you or maybe don't see eye to eye to you, and express to them, like, well, look, like this is how your approach impacts me. It's how approach impacts my wife, how it impacts the other women in my life, my trans friends, my gay friends, like all of the people that are going to be most directly impacted by like what's basically transpired over the last few years. We need to have these conversations. And if we're approaching it from, yes, not all men, or yes, also women too, it's like we're losing the script already, right? And I think for me, like, what I see in this is it's like, first of all, it's a deep seated fear of becoming irrelevant or obsolete. I think that's what most of these men are experiencing. And they ground themselves in aggression and they ground themselves in othering. And then they gravitate towards these iconic figures who appear by all outside appearances to be successful: money, fame, political clout, whatever it might be. But if you actually kind of scratch the surface a little bit, what you actually probably see is a lot of broken and scared men who were bullied and abused as children and grew up to be essentially another version of the same thing, just perpetuating that trauma.
Right.
So, for in some ways, like my whole perspective on this is about disrupting intergenerational trauma. I was taught in a certain way what masculinity looks like, what it means to be a man. It was not the version of masculinity that I like to embody today. And to me, talking about my experience, sharing with other people how I move through the world, how I make amends with people that I've harmed in the past, how I make a promise to myself and to the world around me to do better and to do differently is an important part of the process. But even just that by itself is really scary. And it's really hard because you're putting yourself out there and you're basically taking a stand on an issue that at least half of the population is not ready to have a conversation about.
No, definitely. And, I might go on a little bit of a tangent here, but it all makes sense in the end. So I was at the gym working out today. I started a regular workout routine again, which yay, it's been like a long time coming. So it's awesome. But I was talking with the trainer and I forget what we were talking about, but it sparked what I was thinking earlier today, which was who exactly do we think we are? So,
Mm,
like, who am I to judge you for the decisions that you make in your life?
mm,
And we do this, like, we assume this power to control and to be like, Nick, what's wrong with you? Why would you decide that? And you're who it doesn't matter what your story is because it's your decision. It's your life. It's not mine. And this is what brings me to a book that my brother-in-law turned me on to last spring. It's called Super Communicators. I cannot
mm,
think of the author right now, but he goes into a part of the book about how disconnected we are in communication because we're so busy yelling at each other about what we want and arguing our point that we're not asking what the issues are for that other person. So like the example he gives in the book is about gun control. And he says, okay, so if you want to protect gun control and then you're somebody that wants more laws around gun control. If you are that person that wants more laws, have you asked the people who do not want their gun rights taken away, have you asked them why?
mhm,
Without it becoming a battle. It's, well, I had a family member, their house got broken into and somebody got shot or they took all their money and they're broke. I mean, there's usually almost always a story, a very personal story that goes behind why we feel so incredibly strongly about something that we will armor up on it.
mhm,
And that to me was just such a beautiful description of what we're not doing and how helpful it could be. That
mhm.
just, you still might disagree, but at least you'll understand why. There will be compassion. There won't be that strong judgment of, well, Nick, why are you making that decision? I think that's ridiculous. Like we're
Mhm.
so busy in doing that and showing up differently. And then in that, we're kind of getting defensive. And like you
Yeah.
mentioned, that in responding to some of those comments, that you weren't showing up as yourself because automatically you were like, they're wrong
Yeah.
or this is disagreeing with me. And it's just interesting. It's just interesting. So, like I said, I might have gone on a little tangent, but
No,
there was
not
a
at
point
all.
made.
No, not at all. I don't think it's a tangent at all. It is, I think what is implicit in what you're actually sharing there is it's actually an opportunity. I would even take it a step further, right? It's asking ourselves those hard questions of like, well, why do I care about this? Where does this particular value come from? Where does a particular core belief come from? This is so much of what I work with my clients on is like really getting clear about like, what are your core beliefs? What are your values? And what are your boundaries and non-negotiables? Like, what are your goals? Like, what's your worldview? Like, how do you process and understand the world around you? And if we're not asking ourselves that question, then we're just basically running a script that somebody else has given us, whether it's our parents or culture or society or whatever it might be. And we get into these kind of traps of logic where it's like, well, this is just how things are. This is just
Yeah.
how these, how we think about things. And that's where the courage comes in. And I think that's where the real first step can be achieved is like if we can stop for a moment and just allow ourselves to assume for a moment that the way we view the world might not be 100% accurate and that the things that we believe and the values that we hold might not necessarily be the ones that we actually care about. Well, then it opens up this opportunity for a process, where you can actually start to do this self-reflection. And then you can start to decide, well, like, okay, if I believe this, or if my values are this, like, what are the actions and uh, ways of being in the world that I need to practice in order to align my actions with my values and with my core beliefs? And it sounds super basic, but most people don't do this kind of work.
Yep.
They don't stop. They just are on autopilot. And then what ends up happening? You end up at least 4 or 5 times in your life, you're going to have something called a life quake. Your worldview is going to get thrown upside down. You're going to hit a crossroads in your life where what was working before is no longer working anymore. and you're going to have to do some soul searching. You're going to have to figure out what to do. Most people called this a midlife crisis. I saw a meme yesterday, which I really enjoyed. It was actually a wizard in this beautiful background. And I said, yeah, and this is drawing from Gen Z slang, but, yeah, I would be in crisis too if my life was mid. And if you're not hip to like what Gen Z nomenclature is, mid is basically just like, basic. It's average.
Oh,
It's not particularly exciting. It's like
settling.
mid. Yeah, mid. Basic, I think, is like what a lot of people from millennials used to call it. But, the thing that really kind of stood out for me in that is like so many of us move through life just experiencing a midlife. So no wonder we're in crisis. No wonder we're feeling fearful of the future and don't feel like we have the tools, and we don't feel like we have community to help us through these things. Religion is at an all-time low. Membership to religious organizations, membership to community organizations is at an all-time low. Most people find camaraderie through social media or through work. And that's a real problem, particularly today with how insecure work is and how challenging it is to just navigate in the workplace. So the thing that comes up to mind to me is like, well, what do you do to have a better than midlife? MID life. Like, what do you do? Well, I think the thing that you do is you start to ask these questions, and you start to design a life that's more aligned with your values and more aligned with your core beliefs. And hopefully, I think this is inevitable. A process that occurs is once you start asking these questions, you start stepping into society more. You start stepping into being part of community more. And this is part of what's actually been lost because of the lack of connection with theology and religion and these other social structures where, in most cultures, you're introduced to society at some point. You're introduced to adulthood at some point, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, quinceañeras, like, there's multiple different versions of this. We don't have that anymore in modern society. The only thing that we really have is like, okay, I've got a job now. I've got a salary, now I have purpose and meaning. So to kind of connect this all the way back to what I was mentioning before, if you have a population of primarily young white men who have no vocation, who have very little hope for the future, who are spending, as Scott Galloway says, a lot of them are spending their time playing video games, vaping, and watching porn instead of engaging with people in the real world and finding a way to make a meaningful contribution to the world. Well, it's not a huge surprise that then what we end up with is essentially what we're witnessing now, this mass disenfranchisement of a large portion of our country, which now leads to an authoritarian and oligarch style of leadership. And to me, it's not just the next 4 years that we need to worry about. It's the next 10, it's the next 20, it's the next generations of young men and women who are going to be coming up in this environment and needing to ask these same questions and not having the mentorship or the leadership or the role models that they need to be able to look to say, this is what conscious leadership looks like. This is what conscious masculinity looks like. So it's a very long-winded way of saying that, I feel like we have a lot of work to do, and we need to start by doing the work ourselves and asking ourselves these hard questions. And then when we come up short, we don't have answers for it, we start to reach out to other people that we trust, and then expand that circle out from there to people that we don't know, to people maybe we don't trust. And this is maybe a provocative statement, and it often, I think, kind of edges into toxic positivity. But I think one of the things that we really need to start to do is to think about not individuals who see things differently than us, but think of it as like this broader organism, right? It's this humanity. It's humans as a whole that all deserve love and compassion, even if we don't agree with them. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to forgive a white supremacist who's out on the lawn, fighting against your rights. Like, we don't necessarily need to forgive them for what they're doing, but we need to at least understand where that's coming from. That's coming from a place of fear, and it's coming from a place of loss, and it's coming from a place of self-protection. And if we can get there, and we can offer those people compassion, even if we don't agree with them, well, we have a hell of a lot better chance of offering ourselves that self-compassion as well, and taking the steps that we need to be able to evolve and move forward as a culture and as a society.
Yeah, and so much of that, Nick, like really everything that you said is honed in on who we think we are,
Mhm.
who how we identify in life. In fact, an exercise that I give to every single client, regardless of where they are in their stage in sessions with me, is what are your values?
Mhm.
And they really don't know how to answer it. It's,
Yeah.
well, to make a good, living, and I work with women, so it's to be a good role model to my kids, and
Mhm.
all the very basic answers. It's kind of like asking somebody, "Who are you?" And their response might be, "I'm a mom, I'm in marketing, and I'm married." It's like, that's
Yeah.
not who you are. There's such a lack of identification to who we are and what our values really are. And because of that, we're identifying with the wrong things, and we're not solidly grounding with what is really important to us. And our values, we'd be surprised, listeners, you'd be surprised when you really focus on your values, how broad they can be. You've got values and boundaries. I'm not talking about boundaries. That's different. And I think that we're overdoing our boundaries as well. But that's a whole other show. Um, Values really is who you think you are and how you think you're reacting. It's like when I
Mhm.
asked myself that question years ago, I was like, I am a walking contradiction.
Mhm.
I'm not acting out on any of the values that I feel are important to me.
Mhm.
And I was okay with answering that. But I think, once we can do that, and again, back to that part of responding honestly, we're going to have a better idea of who we are and what's important to us. Because right now, it just feels like a mismatch.
Yeah.
It's just this all over the place, and that's kind of how things feel.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, and I would
yeah.
even say that, look, you're acting upon values whether you're conscious of it or not.
Yep.
The real boon here, the real opportunity is to become conscious of why you're making the decisions that you are and why you think and feel the way that you do. That's the real power in here. And that's the agency that we get. Now, the tricky bit is like, how do we move beyond this feeling of retreating into ourselves, of keeping
Mhm.
our head down and just muscling it through? Because I feel like that, to a certain degree, and not at all a judgment on you, because I've done the same thing, is like how we've gotten into this mess. It's like we're not willing to take the risk of stepping up and saying, no, this is what I stand for. This is what I believe in. And because not enough of us are doing that, we're not creating those role models for other people to look up to, particularly young people.
Yeah.
So for me, the call to action is, and this is really a call to action to myself more than anybody, but also
Well, this will
anyone
be a
who's,
great way to like wrap up this interview. So I love it. Let's
yeah,
do it.
yeah. So anybody who's listening, the call to action here is to really create the space that you need to be able to ask these questions of yourself. What do I believe in? What is my role in society? How do I want to move forward in the world? And how do I want to help others move forward as well? If you can't answer those questions, that's fine. You might not be ready yet. But the fact that those questions are going unanswered means that you are operating on a system and a process that you have no agency in. So if you feel fearful, if you feel afraid, or if you feel like you don't have agency, the best thing that I think that we can do is to start asking ourselves those questions so we can gain some sort of modicum of control over how we show up in the world and how we respond to it.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. And I love that this episode has been completely different than any of the other episodes that I've recorded. There was a lot of dialogue. There was and it really, for me, it's not about agreement. It's about listening and learning, and then being able to share this information with my listeners and the people that are following you too, Nick. I mean, these are very important conversations that change the course of our lives, whether we
Mhm.
realize it or not. So, Nick, thank you so much again for being here with me and sharing with our listeners. Again, listeners, Nick's contact information and social media details are in the show notes. Please reach out to him. As you can see, he has wonderful conversations. So he loves to invite new friendships. Nick, thanks again.
Thank you.
And listeners, until next time, enjoy yourself, enjoy the moment, and try to discover what your unconscious evolution is.